and thank you for that introduction. I'm going to talk about a bit more than just staffing issues and the supply chain and immigration, because it's all really an inseparable issue that we're facing. I mean, I've been asked to talk about the whole emotive, intractable, legal and political issue that is UK immigration. I've been talking about it one way and another for nearly a quarter of a century. So I lead the business immigration team here at Wright Hassall, and we're dealing with the legal work around the skilled workers, business people and investors who require immigration permission to live, work and bring their families to the UK. And that covers right to work checks and compliance as well. We don't do asylum work, but as I say, that is all part of the picture. And you will deal with law and regulation. I'll give you a partial break and look at how the practical realities keep getting in the way of what the government says it wants to achieve with our overall immigration policy. So the Brexit proposition, if I can call it that, was that we would have less immigration overall, but more control of our borders. In other words, the decisions about who came in. And the first big thing, of course, was the end of EEA free movement. The heralded introduction, although I'll say a little bit more about that, of a new points-based system for economic migration based on the very old concept. These are the words of David Blunkett, of course, long since no longer Home Secretary, those whom we need, not those who need us. And the control of our borders coming down to the prevention of illegal entry and also, although this wasn't, of course, part of the plan, managing the COVID-19 pandemic. The ability to negotiate our own returns policy in relation to failed seekers of asylum and illegal entrants. Interestingly, amid all of that, there's been some success for the government in that as a public concern issue, immigration is now lower on the agenda. But as with most areas of law, immigration has grown a lot over the last 25 years as a body of law. I think it's a long time since one of the early commentators described the legislative incontinence of successive UK governments when it came to immigration acts. And some things in this change and some don't. I can remember speaking at the US Embassy in London in the early 2000s, sharing a panel on which I was the token skeptical lawyer. There was a civil servant who was there as well to give me the audience the official government line, and he said to me just before we went on that frankly it was time for a bonfire of controls in immigration as the UK strove to win the war on talent. He was a bit more restrained when he actually got onto the platform, but not much. And yet, within a fairly short space of time, that war for talent had given way to the war on terror. In came biometric controls, unease about the levels of undocumented illegal migration, right to work checks and penalties for illegal employment were beefed up. Now, this didn't stop the then Home Secretary, Jack Straw, gushing about a Europe of values as the UK became the only major EU state to open its labour markets immediately to millions of workers from the new accession countries in 2004. All of the other major states applied derogations on that for up to 7 years. In 2005, we got an election looming. Then Prime Minister Tony Blair knew that there was unease about this area of policy. It was a potential weakness, and he announced a new tough Australian-style points-based system for immigration. The idea being that it would make what was perceived to be a complex and rather subjective work permit system simple by narrowing 71 main immigration routes into 5 simple tiers, which were then subdivided into more subcategories than we started with. But that was the kind of detail. No one wins elections by fussing about that, and that was rather lost, I think, on the electorate at the time. And then again, you know, after the 2008 economic crash, we got the middle class job losses that follows. In came the coalition government, and we're back to a more circumspect immigration policy. And then came Brexit, and that kind of brings us to where we are now. So in the run up to the vote, immigration was, of course, in some parts of the country more than others, but overall it was pretty much the #1 issue on the doorstep. Farage knew an opportunity when he saw one, and so did Boris Johnson. And they secured their Brexit outcome on the promise that we would take back control of our borders and reduce immigration, and there'd be much greater certainty that migration policy was serving the interests of the UK overall, rather than any EU or other agenda. So immediately after that, Theresa May stepped up from Home Secretary to PM, back came quotas. There was a renewed pledge to reduce net migration from the hundreds to the tens of thousands a year. And as I say, that rhetoric that it was time to protect our resident labour market again, as we strove then for a Brexit deal. And everything they tried, of course, failed. So when the Brexit transition period ended, so did EEA free movement. There was no deal to bring it back in any meaningful form, with the exception of Ireland. So what's happening now? Well, illegal migration is still at very high levels. A week last Wednesday, of course, 27 migrants died when their dinghy deflated as they made a perilous crossing of the English Channel. It was the latest in a string of tragedies. We've had the lorries, now the dinghies, and yet still people are desperate to come to the UK through these desperately dangerous means. And why? Our government declared a year ago, at the end of this year, we will no longer be bound by the EU's laws, so we can negotiate our own returns agreement for migrants. But of course, if you negotiate, you're not the only party in the discussion. The French Interior Minister said after last week's events, that Britain, Belgium, Germany could do more to help France tackle illegal migration and human trafficking issues. He implied that in relation to the UK, it persists especially because migrants are so attracted by our low labour market regulation, our large illegal economy, which frankly is there, and historic underinvestment in border security. They just make the UK too attractive and too accessible to people who are entering the market from that point. France, by contrast, is a safe EU country, but none of the migrants at Calais seem to want to stay there. And we're at this strange transitional point. And it's fallen really back into political rhetoric rather than anything else. Hence this point that was made in the Guardian's cartoon last week. So how's the legal framework got us here? Well, obviously there's no more EEA free movement, Ireland accepted. The common asylum policy no longer applies to the UK because that's EU derived, and the Dublin principles, those include, that those applying for asylum must apply from the first safe EU country that they reach, otherwise their claim will be invalid. That's part of what we've lost, actually. We've had emergency legislation and guidance for the management of COVID, something that the government hadn't planned for, but needed to be in there. And that has been something of a challenge for us as lawyers, actually working out what the government said. Priti Patel, for example, has thrown out promises. Junior ministers have made promises that nobody would be made to suffer as a result of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, overstaying or failing to get to the UK in time. This is with economic migration visas. How does that actually work in practical law, which is highly codified, when nothing has been put through? And we're still dealing with situations day to day where it's difficult to get somebody in the right place at the right time. And, for example, when somebody who's been in a long-term category is applying to indefinite leave to remain, to show that at no point were they in breach of their previous conditions. There's a new plan for immigration. It's a pretty weighty document. I'm not going to plough through it. Here it is. The government's very keen to put through more legislation and to rebuild, if you like, the whole area of policy around it. But I think we can be sceptical that that much can change, given the way that systems have to work and have to be run. So we're looking at things like offshore processing of asylum claims, penalties for third countries which won't cooperate with us in our policy. And that means basically being difficult when it comes to the visas that we give to nationals of their countries. Can be a two-way thing. That some of the countries that were suggested for offshore processing include Albania and Rwanda. And there are also things which give fear to those with a human rights concern, particularly the idea of deprivation of citizenship without notice. Think of Shamima Begum and so forth. So what we have in the economic migration agenda is a new points-based system, which is Australian style, remarkably, almost exactly the words that Tony Blair used in 2005. And here we are, 15, 16 years on with a new points-based system. We do not have a new points-based system for immigration. We've got the existing system, which has been tweaked a bit in various ways. And this slide lists what those are. First of all, the technology platform on which the economic points-based system is built is exactly the same one that we've been using for 15 years almost. We have new names for old concepts. So, for example, what was a tier 2 general visa for sponsoring a skilled worker is now called a skilled worker visa, but it's pretty much the same thing. EEA nationals, of course, are now included in the points-based system because they're no longer able to use free movement. Those who didn't stay in the UK because they were, sorry, those who didn't were not able to use the fact of having been in the UK to apply for status under the EU settlement scheme. In other words, those who are coming to the UK for the first time now need to apply through the points-based system. Quite strange conceptually to those of us who've been working for decades with free movement. Quotas are suspended. The government has pretty much given up on the idea of saying there will only be so many visas available for economic migration. The resident labour market test, which used to make it much more difficult actually for people to be given the permission to work in the UK who needed it, has been discontinued. Salary thresholds have been lowered, skills thresholds have been lowered. There are more eligible roles. Just this week, celebrating the first anniversary, because it was the 1st of December 2020 that the new system, or the revised system, I should say, came in anticipation of the end of the Brexit transition period. The government's actually saying, you know, look, we've got, you know, butchers and hairdressers and people doing all sorts of roles that were not previously sponsorable, if I can use that word, because of the skill level. They now are. And the numbers, of course, through economic migration, lawful economic migration routes, have as a result gone up despite Brexit, despite COVID. So, and there's also an ability to switch more between categories. So on the face of it, you would think, well, actually, what's the government done? It's failed to get to grips with illegal migration, which is actually making its own contribution, positive and negative, to the UK economy. But it has managed to facilitate a continuation of the supply chain in many sectors of the economy through immigration. I know we've got exceptions, things like lorry drivers and so forth, but by and large, it does seem to have delivered on that. And the irony, of course, is it's a long way from the public concern agenda that we started with on the doorstep with Brexit. But it's not quite as simple as that, is it? Because it's how the system actually works in practice that's causing the concerns. And that brings us back, of course, to COVID. It brings us back to the actual way that the system operates. To give you some examples, at the moment, we're dealing all the time with employers who are desperate to get skilled workers into the UK. In the technology sector, this is actually now red hot. There are simply not enough people with the technological skills who are in shortage occupations related to quite advanced areas of IT, and there just are not enough of those people in the resident labour market. They're coming from places like India, Russia, Iran even, and yet when they're already here and they're being moved between employers, it is almost impossible now, and will be, I think, for the next 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks, to get appointments for them to attend biometrics so that their applications can be considered. That has an impact. Of course, COVID has an impact if we're moving into a situation of borders. And as you can probably see, this is actually Dutch arrivals, because it was into the Netherlands that the first people traveling internationally with the new Omicron variant were identified. That's going to have an impact too. The government has done slightly better in managing that. Public health obviously is top of the agenda. And yet, in many of the emergency arrangements that were made last year, there were exemptions for those who were allowed to travel because they had got visas for work in the UK, either because they'd already got them and they were returning, or they'd been granted them for the first time. But the challenges are very much around how the system works. And that's because, as I said earlier, we've got a 15-year-old technology platform, which tends to fall over and need a lot of maintenance. We've got quite rigid, quite complex, and quite restrictive ways that the system itself operates. And there is a lack of capacity in the system to consider applications in time. Now, for example, not everybody who is a migrant in the UK, subject to immigration control and performing an important economic role, is sponsored under the points-based system. We have a number of clients where we're actually dealing with applications based on marriage to a British citizen, for example, where, because there is no access to a fast track, because there simply aren't enough appointments, those applications are mired in delay, preventing travel for weeks, for months. This has an impact on the ability of people to move around, and it affects the UK economy too. So a few more practical realities, and this is what happens really when law, policy and facts collide, as I would put it. We have international obligations which are going to make it more difficult to deal with illegal migration. We still have the pull factors. I've mentioned what the French foreign minister said earlier, and the difficulty of securing cooperation post-Brexit. Our supposedly lax labour market regulation, as the French would see it, may be a case, but we still have skill shortages, we still have economic drivers, and the government is saying that we need to become a high-wage, high-skill economy. Illegal migration mitigates against that. And the treasury cost, as I've put it, of effective immigration control, it's actually very expensive to run an immigration system properly. Now, if you're bringing into the UK under the sponsored routes a family of 4, you can be looking at, as an employer, funding £20,000 worth or more of fees. There's an immigration skills charge of £1,000 a year, which goes with a certificate of sponsorship. That wasn't there a few years ago. There are priority fees to get appointments dealt with quickly. There are application fees. There are fees for demonstrating English language ability, where you need certification for that. There is the immigration health surcharge as a deemed contribution to the NHS. When I first started practicing in this area in the late 1990s, all immigration applications were free. And yet that funding per application is not enough still to deliver a completely effective system for us in the UK. Not that it must be said that any other country in the world doesn't have the same challenges. And this world that we're in, of course, is unstable. We've got climate change, we've got COVID, we've got wars, we've got terrorism. They are going to drive more and more migration, legal and illegal. And our system has simply got to get better at coping with all of it, or we will neither get the economic advantage of immigration or be able to protect ourselves from the economic damage. And of course, where are we at the end of the deal that was sold to us as part of Brexit? We were told there'd be less immigration and more control. We've got more immigration and we've got less control, and it's not serving the economy as well as it can and it should. And successive governments haven't dealt with it well, nor is this government dealing with it as well as perhaps it could. There's a role for businesses, there's a role for lawyers in making things better. We do what we can. We are where we are. And I think there's probably not an awful lot more I can say in the fairly short space of time that I've been allotted. But I think if there's one message that comes out of this, is that the Brexit proposition is not being delivered. And although some things are better, other things are worse. So that, I think, is where I'm going to leave it for the next speaker and for questions later on.